Ambassador to Kosovo for his opening remarks. Thank you.
Is it better? Yes. Good morning, dear representatives of civil society, dear diplomatic colleagues. Very happy to be here today. I arrived to Kosovo a bit less than a month ago, and this is my first public speech today. And I start the speech with a sentence telling that place of Western Balkans is in the European Union. And you have heard it so many times. Some of you may say that this sentence is devaluated already. And I have said it so many times before in my life. Because yes, I have been the EU ambassador in North Macedonia. I have been also EU ambassador in Montenegro. My last job was as Estonian permanent representative in Brussels, just working in a very kitchen of the European Union. But now, when I start my first speech with this sentence, I really believe it, because the enlargement process is credible again. It's more serious than the last 10 years before 2022. And the speech of EU ambassador won't be good enough if there is no quote by the president of Ursula von der Leyen. So that the quote comes from the political guidance, what was confirmed just not a long time ago. It is our moral, political, and geostrategic imperative to complete the European Union. So what does it mean? We have today war in Europe again, the big war. And nobody believed that something like that can happen again. I remember very well 23rd of February 2022, when we had all the intelligence reports, but by that time it was possible to read those intelligence reports also from the newspapers, that war will start tomorrow. I repeat, war will start tomorrow. We knew it, and we were able to do absolutely nothing. This is a terrible feeling. At the same time, the European Union continues to be the most successful peace project in the world. Because since the Second World War, there have been no wars on the territory of the European Union. And at the same time, the European Union assists others to resist the aggression. And this is why the European Union is still very attractive for all of your countries also. Because yes, there are a lot of stories that nobody wants to join anymore, and this train is gone. No, the European Union is very attractive and know it quite well. So, and what is on stake? There is not less and more than the European security architecture. In the simple words, it means, or there is a question, do the bigger ones still have the appetite to change the borders by force and to impose their model of government? No. The European Union stays very firmly against it, and we are thankful for those who are with us to help us to do it. And in this framework, the European Union is considering the enlargement most seriously again after all those years. Because yes, I mean, before 2022, Western Balkan countries heard a lot that your place is in the European Union, but not much was happening, because from one progress report to another progress report, what we don't call anymore the progress reports, because there was not much progress. And I hope very much that this year, when those country reports will come, then we can start to call them progress reports again. You don't hear from Brussels anymore that no enlargement next 5 years or 6 years. Instead of that, you hear a lot of different year numbers that maybe this year the enlargement should happen. But I think that there is no sense to put too much attention to those dates, because nobody gives the date to anybody. Because if the European Union commits that, yes, there will be in year X the enlargement, then it means that the countries who want to join the European Union won't do anything anymore. But this new positive wave is there. And why? Because Vladimir Putin started the war against Ukraine. I just like to record 2021, end of 21, we had Eastern Partnership Summit in Brussels. And the European Union member states were not agree on the short sentence. What said that EU has noticed that Ukraine wants to move towards European Union. I mean, this is a very simple sentence. There was no consensus. And 3 months after, at the Versailles Summit, the European Union leaders called the European Commission to start to give its opinion about the readiness of Ukraine to start the process. I know in Western Balkans not everybody likes that Ukraine is now in forefront of this process. But the reality is, and then there are also the questions that do we need a war to move quicker towards the European Union? No. But the reality is that Ukraine is at the moment the icebreaker, what helps also all others who are moving towards the European Union. And I think that all of you should use this opportunity as much as possible. On EU side, we have to do our work, but this is our business. There is a lot of discussion about the commissioners, how many commissioners there will be, 36 and so on, about the consensus rule that maybe we have to change it because it's very difficult to do our foreign policy if we need to have consensus from every single 27 or in the future 36 countries. But there are a few things which are really needed quickly. One is money, and second, the seats in the European Parliament. And the moment of truth is coming on 1st of January 2027, when we see whether there is money in the EU budget or no. Because the negotiations on the new EU budget will start quite soon, and those are very difficult negotiations. Because you may remember 2020 prime ministers and presidents of the European Union member states were sitting together 4 days and nights just to have this final deal on money. But this is coming, and the seats in the parliament, there are quite a number of free seats when our friends from UK left, then left also several seats in the European Parliament, so that who is quicker, and I mean there is possibility perhaps to get some of them. Now the homework. This is what you have heard a lot as well. Homework needs to be done. This is our message for the governments, because it's a difficult job to do all those reforms, because those reforms are not popular at all. And the governments have to explain that, no, this is not for the European Union, but we ourselves believe that this is good. And I know it from my own country that my ministers didn't believe it always. They went in front of Parliament and explained that, yes, of course, we need it ourselves. We knew that somebody from Brussels was asking it. And the civil society role is extremely important here, because you have to push the governments. You have to let them in the right direction, and this criticism, what you are doing, is extremely important for governments, for the societies, and also for us, because our main product as EU offices or delegations in the countries which want to join the European Union is the input to this annual report. And of course, we have to be absolutely clear that every single fact, what we write in those inputs, is correct. Because again, from my own country, from the government side, we were so happy to see if EU made a mistake. And I thought that, you see, I mean, this is not correct. And just this one mistake could devaluate all the process. Now, we are here in Kosovo. You are coming from different countries. I have to highlight, of course, the normalization process between Pristina and Belgrade through dialogue, because it is absolutely a key. And I know also the expectations to the new commission, new setup, but just I would like to have another quote from the mandate what was given to me by 27 member states, and it says, I have to promote a stable, viable, peaceful, democratic, and multi-ethnic Kosovo which engages in regional cooperation. And I will do it. So, in conclusion, there is a new momentum for all of us. In EU, in Brussels, we have to learn to live with this new situation. But as EU has showed in course of last 2-3 years, we are ready, or member states are ready to adopt very quickly. Because you know, usually European Union is moving very, very slowly. And the message for all of you, be ready when the train arrives, not to be late. Thank you very much.
It's a real pleasure now for me to invite the next panel, which I will also be moderating. I promise we have other people, but so I will be serving the role of the moderator in this one too. But these are three dear friends. Agon Malici, who is one of the initial team that we put up KPDS together. So, Agon, please. Dear friend from Berlin, Valeska Esk, who is advisor to German government special representative for the countries of the Western Balkans, Mr. Mana Sarazin. Yes, and yeah. Dr. Jelena Jankic, thank you. From Florence, Italy. And we have online joining us Dr. Helena Ivanov, who will also make the opening remarks. So I will take now my seat there. I now know what Peter Faith was going through when he had to change all this. Okay, so our panel is focused on
Ja, men må på med.
so our discussion is about how we can be in focus of the European everything. What we can do more, what we are doing, and what we And so I want to invite for our opening remarks Helena Ivanov, who is joining us from London, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. So
From Belgrade at the moment, but I'm able to, from Belgrade. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here today.
maybe you can start us off on this topic. What is your perspective?
Söyle de kemor oje pić u gutu çaya. Gutu çaya ta se što vazon. Gutu.
So, from your perspective, do you think the Western Balkans is losing attention? Or because of everything that's happening, regaining attention, as Ambassador Orav said, that Ukraine is the icebreaker, bringing others into European integration process, giving more credibility to this process?
I think in a way the answer to that question is yes and yes. On one hand, we are obviously not the center of attention, and to be honest, I think we should partly be glad that we're not center of attention. All the countries of the Western Balkans are relatively small countries, and really only bad news can really put us at the forefront of the news. So we're obviously not the center of attention, and I think we should somewhat be happy about it. Secondly, yes, the recent crises and the Russia's invasion of Ukraine specifically has put the Western Balkans back into the focus, partly because there are serious concerns whether a Ukrainian scenario might be repeated in the Western Balkans on one hand, but also there are questions about Russia's influence in the region, especially since, for example, Serbia has not imposed sanctions on Russia. So that has sort of put us back into focus. But what I want to use my opening remarks for is to highlight three key problems with the way in which the Western Balkans are currently in focus when it comes to the EU and Euro-Atlantic alliances generally. The first problem is that I think the Western Balkans are still very much perceived through the 1990s lens. And that framework, that way of thinking about the Western Balkans is extremely outdated. Yes, some problems remain. Yes, certain governments are willing to use the narratives from the 1990s when it suits their political interests. But that is far from saying that the context in which the Western Balkans operates today is the same as it was back in the 1990s. And I think we need to step away from that framework if we want to have a constructive way of engaging with the Western Balkans. I think the second big problem with the current interest in the West Balkans is that there is a lack of general interest. The Western Balkans really don't make the news unless something really major happens, like, for example, Banjska incident from last year, the anniversary of which was yesterday. The problem with this is that the general population of the Euro-Atlantic countries are completely uninformed, completely uninterested. They have no contextual understanding of what is going on. And up to a point, this also exists within certain parts of certain governments across Europe and the Euro-Atlantic alliances. This further then feeds into the first problem that I've said, that people continue to perceive this region through the 1990s lens, which then disables them from having a constructive contribution to the region. And the final problem that I believe exists today is that there really is no effective enforceability mechanisms. And here I particularly want to highlight the Serbia-Kosovo normalization talks. We have had numerous instances of agreements verbally accepted, like the ones in Brussels and in Ohrid, but also the big ones like the Brussels, which is now over a decade old. And many aspects of those agreements are yet to be implemented. There's very little hope that they will be implemented in practice. Maybe some like to say otherwise, but if we look at what is going on in the ground, the situation continues to deteriorate. The tensions are rising. Sides are making unilateral moves and they're not effectively punished for it. And at the end of the day, it is the people who live in Kosovo of all ethnicities that are paying the high price for this. So I think the international community that is involved in this region needs to find a way to force the two sides to sit at the table, to make the deals, but then also to implement those deals in practice. If that doesn't happen, it's the people on the ground who suffer. It's the governments in the Western Balkans who have the ability to make unilateral moves without paying the consequences. And ultimately, all of this decreases the leverage and the importance and the reputation of the international community that's involved. I'm going to stop there because I think other panelists surely have great things to do, but these were the three key issues that I sort of wanted to highlight when it comes to the way in which the Euro-Atlantic community is engaged in the Western Balkans at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elena. That was a very, I think, a lot of food for thought and good remarks to open our discussion as well. But what I will do is maybe present a scenario, as last night at the dinner, we had a very good discussion last night with few colleagues during dinner about Kosovo-Serbia relations, and as Besnik, a journalist, mentioned, we did these scenarios last year, and some of those scenarios came to fruition, unfortunately the wrong ones. But so if we think scenario, and maybe Valeska, will start with you, because if there is one country in the EU that we feel cares about us, is Berlin and Germany. You know, it's not very hard in Berlin to find people who deal with Balkans, we feel, unlike some other EU capitals, let's say. So don't, I hope I'm not creating any controversy with this statement, but we have Berlin process as well. But if we think of a scenario of 2025, Asia-Pacific, growing instability, Ukraine moving towards more difficult periods, with everything that's happening, is it, how real is a scenario where the Western Balkans is just left to its own, in a way, dynamics? And how dangerous it would be if it's a reality? And what can we do to stop it?
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks for having me. Yes, of course, it's true that the Euro-Atlantic community is faced with many challenges. The Russian war against Ukraine being the biggest threat to European security in a very long time. It's also a war against our values, our freedom, and our way of living. We have many internal challenges as well. You mentioned some others, but I can only speak on behalf of the German government that this is certainly not going to change Germany's unwavering commitment to the region. I would even say to the contrary, for us it's even more important to integrate the Western Balkans into the European Union, and for those who want to join NATO, also NATO. It has been a priority of this German government ever since its It's a coalition treaty. Sorry. But it is also, and I think Ambassador Rode alluded to that this morning, it's an issue which has quite a lot of bipartisan consensus among almost all political parties in the German Bundestag. So you can really be sure that also a future German government will maintain a focus on the region. Germany continues to be among the biggest donors and investors across the region, and I would like to briefly also mention the Berlin process, which is a format that this government has revived or reinvigorated, and we consider it key in supporting the region on its path to the European Union. Looking at what has been happening ever since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I would like to mention one particular initiative that I think shows that we are also adapting our support to the region to new circumstances. At the peak of the energy crisis in the fall of 2022, when energy security and energy prices were also a huge challenge internally in Germany, we initiated the regional climate partnership with the Western Balkans and pledged 1.5 billion euros to support energy transition and energy security in the region. I'm just mentioning this as an example of how we have been also responding to new challenges that emerged. And I would like to repeat also what the ambassador said earlier in his speech, that the EU Council has really firmly recommitted also to the idea of EU enlargement by opening the door to Ukraine, Moldova and Georgia in addition to the Western Balkans, and this certainly does not change the EU's commitment to the region. I would say at the same time, in light of the numerous challenges, it will be all the more important for the Western Balkans to advance on their individual paths towards the Euro-Atlantic and especially EU integration. And while it may be a lengthy process, it is where the region belongs. And as I mentioned, we would really like to see the region make progress, especially, of course, on the fundamentals. I think it will be important for the region to really work on becoming a reliable partner also to the Euro-Atlantic community, not only starting when they are finally part of it, but already now while on their way. This doesn't only refer to reforms, of course, the fundamentals, foreign policy alignment is all extremely important, as it remains a strategic choice by every country in the region to become a member of the Euro-Atlantic community. But instead, lately, we have seen so much trouble coming from the region on top of all of the crises that we have in the world. And I'm not going to list examples because I feel I will be talking too long, but I'm sure that you can all think of examples on your own. And I think this is not really how the region can present themselves as reliable partners to the Euro-Atlantic community. So it would, in my view, and I can only repeat what the EU ambassador said, extremely important for the region to use this geopolitical moment in a very constructive way, and to make use also of the increased support that is coming from the European Union and from some of the member states, including Germany. And this is not just, I'm not just talking about the money in the growth plan, for example, but I'm also talking about Office of the European Union for an advanced joining of certain elements prior to membership, be it the European payment area or be it joining of the European electricity markets. And I can only repeat that I think it's really important for the region to grab these opportunities, to make use of these opportunities and not stall their implementation, as currently is, for example, the case with the integration of the electricity markets. I would leave it at that for now.
Thank you so much, Valeska. Agon?
Thanks, Dani. Great to be back at KPDS. I would like to, strike a balance between the overwhelming cynicism we are having over this subject and the uber optimism that is being generated from some circles in Brussels, to start maybe a bit more rational position on the subject. Yes, there is new momentum for enlargement coming after the Ukraine war, but I do really fear that it's already starting to fade, because that's a window that opens and then can very easily fade. I do fear that the push and the pull factors, so either both the pull factors from the EU and the push factors from the region are both weakening. The main problem, the ambassador mentioned the train. He said, when the train comes, you have to be ready to jump in. The problem that the EU has is, I don't think it's fully aware yet, maybe some circles finally are, is that enlargement cannot work like with like an on and off button, you know. Oh, we stopped it in 12 you know, when was
14.
it? 14 or 11 when Croatia joined. And now we can just switch the button on again. And, you know, what has happened in the meantime with the countries is a severe deterioration. So you cannot just, you know, hold the countries for, you know, all these years and expect for the kind of transformation to happen. So we are restarting, re-entering, in a way, a new momentum from a much worse position, either from democracy standards, you know, take, for example, the case of Serbia. So who would want to admit a country with that degree of autocracy, another Viktor Orban type of regime in the EU? Or in the case of Kosovo, you know, non-recognizers, you know, we don't stand a chance to even get candidate status because of that. And these are all issues that the EU enlargement process was supposed to be solving over the last decade. But because it stopped, it didn't. The EU was and always was a peace-building instrument and democratization instrument for us, but it did not play that role over the last decade. So hence we have the bilateral disputes still there, which are preventing the accession process. We have erosion in democratic standards throughout the region. So we're not starting from the same position where we stopped. We're starting from a worse kind of position. A lot of it has to do sort of with the credibility of the EU, which has been eroded. The ambassador mentioned the progress reports. They used to be events. Civil society used to wait for them, anticipate those reports. And now I don't even think we even read them. Because the EU Commission, even though it's still seen as a friend of enlargement, you know, its weight has been decreased. You know, what the Commission says kind of feels like the UN speaking in a way, you know, like almost like a powerless, weak body. Why? Because the Council is seen as where the weight is, and the Council has been over the last decade the one creating the obstacles in the member states. And we have to wait and see whether the Council, you know, we have to see to believe it, whether the Council will continue to play that role, or whether it will, you know, truly show some sort of determination. I think one positive signal is that the names being mentioned for the Commission are positive, either for the EAS or for the enlargement, you know, with Slovenia taking over that role. It is generally seen as a sort of positive signal in terms of credibility. But as I said, the Commission is one thing, the Council is another, and what I would expect or hope, you know, to see as a signal of things changing is to at least have some sort of qualified majority voting during the enlargement stages in the process. You know, we cannot have, you know, full membership will require the vote of all the members of the EU, but at least during the stages, because the new enlargement methodology has created a lot of new traps and opportunities for one individual country to block others. And we've seen that happen over the last decade, and there's a huge risk it will continue to happen. So unless we see a QMV process, at least for the negotiating stages, I don't think we will be seeing the restoration of the credibility. Now, why am I saying that, you know, the push and pull factors are weakening is that, yes, there are a lot of friends of the Balkans in the EU who really want the region to go in, whether it's countries, whether it's forces within certain countries. But there are also quite a lot of cynics and realists who I think don't mind having the Western Balkans as this kind of a gray zone where they dump human and environmental rights to the, you know, like, you know, oh, why don't you do the lithium extraction and, you know, without us having to worry about the environmental concerns, or why don't you take prisoners or migrants from our country, well, you know, get rid of our problems. So dumping these sort of, I do think there is that current also within the EU that doesn't really mind leaving the Balkans the way it is. But what we're doing as a region is that we're not giving a strong case to our friends, because you're going to Brussels and they have a lot of problems within the EU, they have a lot of problems around the world, and you come as 6 different countries complaining about one another and, you know, and reinforcing the image of a region that is not ready and does not, you know, so if these things are to move, the real drive has to come from the region and from leadership in the region, you know, to make bold decisions on the Kosovo-Serbia dispute, on, you know, all the various problems creating obstacles for one country, and to speak to Brussels with one voice and say, we're ready, we want to push this. That will give a case to those in the EU who are supportive to advocate and fight for us. Right now, I fear going back into that kind of stasis where the supporters of enlargement, don't have what to support. Those who are okay with leaving the Balkans the way it is and dumping the issues to the Balkans are fine to continue as we go, and we are in a position where we just keep complaining. So I'll just end on that note. Yeah.
Thanks, Agon. Yeah, I remember in 2013 we were in Zagreb with the Regional Academy for Democracy, and there was quite enthusiasm about prospects for European integration, but it kind of started to weaken, and our Croatian friends, part of the academy, were already feeling no longer part of Balkans. And I remember even when we were talking about, let's say, doing Aspen Institute in the region, our discussions a lot focused on how to name it anything but the Western Balkans, Aspen Institute. So Adria and some of these options. So is it just image problem, or is it real? Like, are we that difficult to deal with that so it's easier maybe just to leave us, manage us, it sounds wrong, but to say the strategy is just about managing Western Balkans from exploding rather than focusing on sustainable reforms?
Well, I think that essentially links very nicely to Helena's introductory remarks, right? Because I think the story goes both ways. There is the general image of the Western Balkans in the European circles, in the circles that have to decide about Euro-Atlantic integration. And to be honest, they don't wake up with the Western Balkans on their mind unless there's trouble. So this is something we need to start from when thinking about the general interest in the region and the general interest in how things unfold around here. I think this brings me then to your scenario, which in a way sounds a little bit bleak, but it's not that far away from what has been going on since the Russian invasion, full-scale invasion on Ukraine in 2022. And I think both Valeska and Agon had mentioned here how it has reinvigorated the process of EU integration, EU enlargement. And it has been on a stalemate since 2013, 2014. There has been an official freeze, which had never happened before, for all the candidates in the line of accession. Now, this new momentum is a sort of an opportunity for the region. And it's not for the sake of the Western Balkans. We all know why enlargement has been reinvigorated. It has been reinvigorated as a tool to secure Europe, not necessarily for the sake of the region itself. Now, when we think about it, when we think about the region in a more global perspective, we can see a couple of dynamics. Now, the lack of a proper focus, or the focus that the region expects from the Euro-Atlantic friends, if you wish to, is something that has opened up a sort of a vacuum. So this lack of interest, the lack of engagement as expected, has enabled the creation of dependencies on Russia, on China, especially the economic ones, and has in a way not allowed the democratic society in these countries to flourish. What happens when you have the situation on the ground combined with the lack of interest from the European Union? Obviously, you have the creation of local power strongholds, which then further destabilize the region. So I'd like to then conclude by reiterating or echoing the remarks that we've heard from the US ambassador this morning. And I think it's time for this region, if you wish, to wake up from the state of the need for perpetual crisis management. And if you think about crises, they bring progress. So I think we need to get out of this vicious circle of managing crisis and embrace them as an opportunity to move forward, to resolve problems instead of creating further ones. So I think I'll leave it at this, and I'm happy to discuss further.
Okay, so what I will do is now open the floor for comments, questions, because in the first panel we didn't have a chance to hear from the public a lot. So if anyone has an intervention they want to make at this stage, raise your hand. Uroš and then Jakub. Okay. Yeah, okay, Jakub, then Uroš. Yes, sorry.
Hi, I want to thank the panelists for coming out today and speaking regarding the topic of the Euro-Atlantic focus. My name is Jakob Weitz. I'm a freelance journalist and researcher in Kosovo. And my question is directed for Agon regarding the dumping of migrants. Specifically, we're in a situation right now we have, as a Danish citizen, and I'm very concerned with what's going on regarding the current visit of the Justice Minister to Kosovo this week to show the prison in Gjilan that they're renting out to send the asylum seekers that are currently jailed in Denmark to send them to Kosovo. In my perspective, it's a complete insult to Kosovo's path to integration and to Kosovo's and to the EU. What is EU sending a signal to Kosovo by sending these migrants to Kosovo? You have a similar deal with the UK and Rwanda, and then you have a similar deal with Denmark and Kosovo. So I wanted to ask you if you could elaborate more on your perspective on this deal and what it means in regard to the Euro-Atlantic focus on the Western Balkans. Thank you.
Well, I don't like to maybe focus just on this one. I just maybe would like to focus on the pattern. Albania has also done the same with Italy now. I think the pattern of Western Balkans countries having to fulfill these sort of conditions in order to get political support in the EU is problematic because, you know, because it shows that the enlargement process has lost, you know, the credibility or you know, what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be about the fundamentals and about Copenhagen criteria. But now a lot of the regional countries need to find policy champions in the EU, and sometimes these champions, you know, are far-right governments. And this is really really problematic because this is a way, in some cases, how they also secure some form of appeasement from criticism on their democratic standards. I really think this is a worrying trend and the pattern, without focusing on Kosovo's case, which is obviously has the same kind of repercussion and might create also legal problems for the countries in which these new situations are sort of being created. But yeah, I had other things to say, but I'll leave more remarks for the last conclusion.
But I'm sure there is a joke to be made about Copenhagen criterias, you know, like being exported to the region and then criminals. So I guess our major foreign policy achievement over these 4 years has been becoming a penal colony in a way. So very good point, Jakob. Especially, I'm also a bit critical on that, but that's not the subject. But Agon is saying that's perhaps a way how, I guess Serbia has lithium mines, we have prisons where we can rent out, and so that's how we can keep up some kind of a...
There is a risk of a race to the bottom of what we can offer for the West to dump in the Balkans.
Uroš.
Thank you very much. So me again, pardon my curiosity. So I'm still Uroš from the European movement in Serbia. So I'd like to ask you the same question I recently asked the new ambassador of the United Kingdom to Serbia, His Excellency Mr. Ferguson. So now that all the focus pretty much of Europe is on Ukraine and the situation there, how do we stay relevant? How do we stay in focus in the Western Balkans? How do we avoid being forgotten? Because we still have our own crises. We're still not peaceful. What do we need to do to stay sort of in the eyesight of Europe?
Let me add to Uroš, what can civil society do? Because this is civil society. So maybe we start from, again, Valeska, Jelena, and then Agon.
Yeah, thank you. I'll maybe start with that last question because I feel like I have already mentioned a few things that in my view are extremely important, which is among others for the Western Balkans to do their part of the accession to the European Union or to the Euro-Atlantic structures, to become a reliable partner of the Euro-Atlantic community. I think this is really important, and I think you just mentioned this constant crisis management that we also have in the Western Balkans, and I think, I mean, on the one hand, constant crisis management will obviously keep the focus also of the Euro-Atlantic community on the Western Balkans, but I don't think this is the kind of focus the Western Balkans really should be aiming for. This is why I keep repeating myself when I talk about becoming reliable partners. I would like to very briefly comment also on some of the other things that were said, because I have heard now a couple of times about an official freeze of enlargement since 2014, and I really need to contradict that notion, I have to say. I'm not going to say that the statement of the former Commission President was particularly fortunate, but he never said that we will freeze enlargement or that enlargement will no longer exist. He simply said that he does not expect any new members during this Commission's mandate. For many member states, this was simply stating the obvious, because none of the Western Balkan countries was actually prepared enough to realistically join within that Commission's mandate. Again, I'm not saying it was a fortunate statement, but it was most certainly not an official freeze of the EU's enlargement policy. And I think this is really important to note. And I feel like this has sometimes also been used as an excuse not to deliver on the reforms that might have been difficult. And maybe also on the notion that the Commission has become so weak, and also related, Agon, to what you were saying on the QMV, because I feel that these are two very important points. First of all, it's always been the Council who had the last word in the accession process, and I think this is also something that institutionally makes sense. But if you look at the new growth plan by the Commission, this is really something where only the Commission is going to judge whether the countries will have fulfilled the reform agendas. This is not up to the Council to decide. So this is something that really shows how important the Commission still is and will be. When it comes to QMV, and this is going to be my last point because I don't want to take too much of your time, but just in case this isn't known yet, this German government has launched an initiative in Brussels, and we are trying to reform the accession process exactly in the way that you, Agon, phrased. We would like to see more QMV decisions in the Council in the enlargement process, at least for the technical steps of the process, because also we feel it would be important to reinvigorate the process and to avoid these stalemates that we have seen in the past.
Thanks, Valeska. I guess we made a mistake in 2014, how we treated Juncker's statement. And now Michel's statement about 2030 also is taken seriously. So I think they need to check their speeches sometimes. But
yes, thank you, Uroš, and thank you, Dani, for the questions. To Uroš, I'd actually be very interested to learn how the British ambassador has responded to your question on how we keep the region still relevant amidst all the everything that is happening in the world. And I think that this question can be answered from a multitude of points. How do we stay politically relevant? How do we stay relevant in the context of security discourses? It depends on what you also consider to be this relevance. So if we think about the process of EU enlargement and how the region can stay relevant, I would say it's to get out of the state of perpetual crisis management and move forward with reforms to use the opportunities that also have been mentioned as a part of this new enlargement momentum. Now, just to respond to, and I do agree with you, Valeska, that the statement was unfortunate, but it has been perceived in the region as a sort of so at least a temporary freeze of the process, and the effect of it was exactly what you have mentioned. So it has achieved, it slowed down reforms, it demotivated both the citizens of these countries and especially the politicians to implement, to deliver on enlargement. So how can we change that? How can we mobilize also civil society to help deliver on these processes to make the Western Balkan societies better? And I think civil society has a massive role, and it's something that can be a driver of change. And we've seen this in the 1990s, not only in this region, but also across Eastern Europe, where civil society has driven political and societal reforms. We've seen it in this region in the early 2000s, when civil society was the sort of a force behind this short-lived, if I can say, democratic moment in the Western Balkans. What has happened in the meantime is that possibly quite a lot of the civil society actors, and I hope that colleagues here won't mind, has assumed a sort of a meta-political function. Since the regional politics work in the way they work, civil society has been a sort of a check on the political actors. And in so doing, in so being, in assuming this role, it seems to me that it has somehow lost the link with citizens themselves in a great part. So citizens at the end of the day are those who should be empowered to take ownership of societal processes. So perhaps a balancing or a higher engagement, if you wish, with citizens in the region, better strategic communication of what democracy, of what European integration is about, coming from civil society and not only from politicians or from the news from Brussels, etc., might bring this process closer to citizens, might reinvigorate it from the bottom up.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think Valeska said that we need to give something to the table and become credible partners. I think leadership is needed in the region. Imagine if you're talking about projections and scenarios, you know, all these global fronts opening, you know. The last thing that our friends in the West need is for the Balkans to be another crisis spot. So if we can start becoming net contributors of security in Europe rather than net beneficiaries, that would be a good start to get some credit. I do feel that that would be our biggest contribution. Imagine a Kosovo-Serbia normalization deal happening, you know, in this context. That would bring a huge, I would say, shift in the narrative in the region. What are the possibilities? It would send a huge and very important signal to the friends in the West to you know, to keep this momentum going. It will be a big boost to democratic reforms. But I think we have one major obstacle, and that is that we don't only lack leadership right now. I think society in general, I'm not talking about civil society act, but society in general has lost its focus and its interest in a way. You know, yes, if you look at polls, they will say they want to join the European Union. But I don't really think people are really willing to take either the risks or take the necessary decisions to take those steps in most of the countries, you know. Sometimes the values, you know, yes, they will say yes to the European Union, but when it comes to specific issues or values that it takes to become a member of the European Union, well, there's a contradiction between what people actually want or they think the European Union is and what it actually is. I think we've lost the battle in terms of values in society, and there's a sense of paralysis, and there is no drive coming from society either, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to talk to people, to young people, about why this narrative matters. Unlike 10 or 15 years ago or 20 years ago when we were young and without gray hair, when this was the main narrative and aspiration, I don't think it is for the current young generation, and I think that is one big problem. Another just small important thing, there is not only the issue of the EU here, there is the very, very important issue of NATO. I think this is an area where actually more progress could be achieved in the short and medium term, and where actually, even while EU enlargement had stopped over the last decade, and you know, I disagree that, yes, the policy might have officially been that there was enlargement, but I think effectively there wasn't. NATO expansion continued. Even during the Trump administration, Montenegro and North Macedonia were able to join NATO, and that was a very, very welcome development, because imagine that not having happened in the current situation with Ukraine. So I think with Kosovo and Bosnia in particularly, a NATO path is something tangible and to be pursued, and maybe even more faster than EU accession, hopefully with no major change in the US elections. But I think that is something that the focus should remain in, because it would help contribute to the climate also for EU accession, and you know, at least we will feel more safe to take the bold political decisions that are needed for EU accession. Yeah.
Thank you, Agon. And if Helena is listening, I want to bring her in now. So Great Britain or UK was brought up about how the region maintains relevance. I guess this was a conversation in London too after Brexit. You know, does it where is that? Does it lose relevance? And I think one thing that happened good with that is Western Balkans became a priority area for UK, or greater priority area, and we see a more, I think, UK interest now in our region. So maybe you can reflect on this, Elena, but also on this, what civil society can do, because this is obviously a civil society forum, so how we can help more.
Yeah. So in terms of the UK, I would say it became a greater area of interest, but it's far from saying that it's a great area of interest. And I think the three problems that I've analyzed in my opening remarks are particularly noticeable in the UK. I think, certain countries in the EU, partly because Serbia is, for example, in the Western Balkans, many are candidates to join the EU, and the normalization talks between Kosovo and Serbia, the EU is more interested in being continuously informed to what is going on in the Western Balkans, which is not necessarily the case in the UK. The UK is one of those examples where they really jump onto something when really things get complicated and things get tough. So I'm glad to see that the UK has a greater interest, and I'm hoping that we get more of that, especially with the new UK ambassador to Serbia. But I think definitely, the UK needs to step away from the 90s lens of seeing things and get more updated in terms of what is going on a day-to-day basis, rather than just put spotlight on the Western Balkans when something really, really, really badly goes wrong. And then in terms of the civil society organization, so I think really, I agree with everyone on the panel that the momentum for joining the EU is sort of passing amongst the general population. Here, let me just cite very, very briefly some figures. There was a poll in February and March of this year conducted by IRI. Albania and Kosovo remain very strongly supportive of the West and want to join the EU. Serbia is somewhat perhaps expected, an outlier where this support is way, way below 50%. But perhaps most problematically, Bosnia, Montenegro, and North Macedonia are all expressing less than 40% for the West, which I think this appetite for the West and for the EU is generally decreasing, partly for all the reasons that the other panelists have mentioned, the never-ending accession process, the questions regarding is the enlargement frozen, is it not, when are we going to join, et cetera, et cetera. So I think from the perspectives of civil society organizations, I think they can play an important role in, on one hand, serving as checks and balances on their own governments. And let's be real, the Western Balkan governments have not implemented all the reforms that are necessary, and some are even not willing to really implement them. So I think civil society organizations can play a great role in pushing for those good changes within societies. But I also think what's increasingly more important is for civil society organizations to pressure the EU and the Western allies to pay more constructive attention on the region. Economic cooperation is great, and I'm sure that it's here to stay. I also think that certain security interest in the region is here to stay. I think, for example, KFOR is playing an incredibly important role in maintaining peace and security in Kosovo, and I think it serves as a great deterrent to both sides, when it comes to substantial escalation. But what I think we need is more direct, high-quality, tailor-made engagement on behalf of EU politicians with general population of the Western Balkans. I think they need to, bring back the excitement of people when they think about the EU. Everyone is now more and more cynical when they think about the prospects of joining. They think we'll never join, and even if we join, that it's going to come at a huge sacrifice. There are all of these stories that were mentioned on this panel, about EU dumping stuff on the Western Balkans. It's something that circulates among the people, and it has to be partly fixed by the EU itself. It needs, the EU basically needs a better campaign for the region. And I think civil society organizations can serve as a good, way to push the EU to do that, but also assist the EU to do that, give the local context, the local understanding, the local issues, and sort of help Western politicians bring back the enthusiasm among the people of the Western Balkans when it comes to joining the EU. I think without that, the accession process is going to be even more hard than it already is in status quo.
Thank you, Elena. Now, second round of questions from the audience or comments. Tifta. Anyone else? So we can take... And Krenat.
Yeah, maybe a question for Agon, going quickly to the enlargement momentum. There is definitely more unity in the EU at the moment for moving forward, at least with negotiations with Ukraine and Moldova, than there is for the Western Balkans. But there's also an understanding that that cannot be done at the expense of Western Balkans, meaning we cannot leave Western Balkans aside, and at the same time there's not enough, leadership, as you mentioned, but also progress on reforms. However, there are discussions going on creating a success story in the Western Balkans in terms of EU enlargement, and seems that Montenegro seems to be the choice. What's your take on that? What do you think? Is this approach on decoupling the countries by moving forward with one candidate going to send a positive signal in the region?
Can someone give the microphone? Oh, thank you, Tefta.
I just wanted to remind the panelists, although they provided various arguments as to why we have the stagnation of Euro-Atlantic integration of Western Balkans, I think you also forgotten to mention one element which is very important, the complexity of institutional setup of EU. As you know, the enlargement goes with the consensus, and one country can block it. And unless we do not have the amending of the current EU treaty, there is no enlargement. So I think this is an element which is important to mention. People in the EU are very skeptical of enlargement for various reasons, migration and stuff like this. But one of the reasons is that the bad examples that are currently in the EU, for example, the Orban government, they do not want to repeat this scenario once again. So I think this is an important element which you forgot to mention.
Thank you. Maybe we forgot, but I did hear we talked about QMV, that's qualified majority voting, and all the need to reform. So we did touch. But yes, they do not want another Hungary, but they do not want another Cyprus, Klenar. So I think this is both what they don't want. But maybe to return, with Agon, Tefta, I think, posed the question.
Yeah, also just to briefly touch upon this, yes, they will need constitutional changes for, would be needed for full membership. But what we're talking here about is to include qualified majority voting during the process. We mentioned it here, so that when a chapter is closed and opened, or a cluster is opened, Bulgaria, for example, with North Macedonia cannot use these sort of bilateral disputes to stop these stages, the steps, the technical process. And when it comes to the end, when a country reaches the end of the negotiation, yes, then it will require full consensus, because it's impossible to overcome. On Tefta's question, I do think the region would benefit from a bit of a race in terms of, there's a door opening, whoever wants to jump in has a chance now. Montenegro is the obvious choice because it's way ahead than everybody else in terms of the negotiation process. I do fear, however, that the hopes are a bit too high for that government because of its stability, and because I would dare say Serbia's veto power over Montenegro's government. Whether we like to say it, believe it or not, or say it or not, whether Montenegro joins depends really much on whether Serbia would like to see it join. And I think, so these are the sort of geopolitical implications that I think people are kind of not taking into account. But yes, it would be very good to reward certain steps forward and create, not a race to the bottom that I mentioned on who is getting, who we can dump our problems to, but who is reforming more. And on this end, I would also add that the financial instruments are insufficient. We talk a lot about this growth plan, but if you talk realistically to economists who've seen the numbers or know the numbers, this is really marginal money in terms of what countries from the previous accession waves used to get. This is not the kind of transformative resources that will have a leader or a side say, oh, yes, we will do these reforms. So I do think that the financial envelope has also to be added to these incentives as well.
Thank you. And maybe for the last round of questions. So we mentioned here that how we can sustain that focus is first domestic. So the region needs to move away from that what Jelena said, and others, I think, perpetual management mode. So we need to, and Agon said, be contributors to net security, right? There is then external, which is, it also depends on EU and NATO and the political development. Crenardo brought the third element, the citizens in EU as well, you know, how much they want to deal with our region and that the perception they have about our region. And I really like what Jelena said, that EU needs Helena as well, about a campaign of EU to engage directly with citizens as well. But it seems to me there is also a lot of misperception among EU citizens about the Balkans, starting with physical, for instance. I think there is still, I had occasions when the perception about our region was that it is a frontier, not surrounded. So maybe with Valeska, to start our last thoughts, in a way, we talk about this scenario, you know, the region needs to move away from that perpetual mode of crisis, EU needs to reform, but we also think chances for these two to happen, you know, like Agon said, or you mentioned, what about if there would be a normalization agreement and between Kosovo and Serbia, that it's working, that it's functional? But we know chances are limited. So what do we do? What's the outcome? Are we more, I guess, to end with a classic optimist or pessimist on this focus?
I don't know if I have an answer on that, but maybe to start with the image of the Western Balkans, because it was mentioned several times, and the media in member states was mentioned. And I'm not saying this because this in any way reflects the government's position, but just as an observer of the kinds of media reporting that we have had in the past, let's say, couple of years on the Balkans. We have had the lack of foreign policy alignment vis-à-vis the Russian war on Ukraine. We have had Banska, of course. We have had the situation surrounding the elections in Serbia. We have had several reports on organized crime and mafia in Albania. We have had reports on Zvečan and the unrest in the north and the crisis in the north. So putting all of this together, this is obviously not creating the best of images. At the same time, the German, I don't have current polls, but the German population's attitude towards the Western Balkans or towards EU enlargement hasn't been that bad, despite all of this reporting. So what I'm trying to say is that I think it would also go a long way in improving the image of the Balkans in member states, in member states' populations or in the public, if there was good news to report on as well. And this maybe brings me even to this notion of there has been more interest to move forward in the enlargement process with Moldova and Ukraine than with the Western Balkans. I think there has also been, I'm not dealing with Moldova and Ukraine, so I have to say that maybe in the beginning, but I think the reform dynamic has been stronger in Ukraine and Moldova than it has been lately in the Western Balkans. And we can debate about the reasons for that. I don't want to go into this, especially since I'm not working on Moldova and Ukraine, but this is also the reality. And the same goes for Montenegro. This is the country where we've had at least the biggest reform dynamic lately, and this has been rewarded. From a German government's perspective, this has nothing to do with decoupling, because for us there is no coupling of countries anyway. We consider the accession process more in the terms of a regatta principle. I think this is also the language that the European Union itself uses. It's supposed to be a merit-based system with all of the flaws that might be there, and we talked about QMV earlier, but it is not in a way that we consider that the Western Balkans or accession of the Western Balkans needs to be a package deal in any kind of way. Which brings me maybe briefly also to the growth plan. I don't want to comment about the amount of money, but just in general, I would argue that the growth plan money is obviously not designed to buy reforms here in the region, and this might sound as a phrase that you have all heard so many times, but for the reforms that the European Union asks countries to do are first and foremost to the benefit of the citizens of the countries, and of course they are related to the alignment with the EU standards, which obviously is extremely important for the European Union. And maybe one last word, because it was mentioned quite a lot of times as well. I would maybe not overestimate the economic interest in the region as being separate from the EU from the EU perspective of the region, because I think a lot of the economic interest from EU member states, companies, which is, I mean, these are private investment decisions mostly, comes from the perspective that the Western Balkan countries will one day be members of the European Union. So I think these processes are also very closely linked to one another. And sorry, I forgot to comment on the CSO role. You asked me to do that as well. I simply forgot. I was not trying to avoid
the reason I want, because you're the right person. With Aspen Institute, you did so much to bring the region closer to the EU with the Western Balkans program, and now you are advising government. So I think you can really contribute to this. What we can do better.
Well, I think what is extremely important. Maybe two roles of civil society. The one being the expert side of things. I think that civil society organizations can provide a lot of expertise and analysis, not just to their own governments, but also to EU institutions, to our government. I mean, we regularly talk to civil society from the region because they give us a different perspective on things, or they might have expertise on a specific issue. I think this is a really important role for civil society. But I also think, and this was mentioned before, it's the outreach to the public. It's also the attempt to explain to citizens the benefits of the European Union, or the reasons for the policies, or these kinds of issues. And I think in that sense they can play a really important role. And of course also continue advocating with your own governments if you feel that things are not going in the right direction. I think these are very, very important roles for civil society. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to kind of explore a little bit this idea of the image of the Western Balkans, and I would in a way connect what Helena had said before with what Valeska has just mentioned now. So Helena mentioned that the Western Balkans does not get any traction in the media in the European countries and perhaps the US and more broadly, unless there's bad news. And this is how this image gets created and spread. And perhaps, yes, that's an issue with contemporary media. Sensationalist stories capture far more attention. But stories in the mainstream media about good things that happen in this region, or the value added of the region in terms of its economic potential, in terms of its potential for companies from Western Europe, in terms of the educational, tourism opportunities, services, etc., that this region has to offer, is something that would need to be communicated within the European Union to improve the image of this region in broader circles. Now, how that's going to be done, don't ask me, because I don't, in a way, I don't have a channel to how media is created within different circles. Now, I think that at the very level in which civil society can act, this is where the image of the Western Balkans could be improved in the context of a greater engagement, both with European institutions, but also with European citizens. So how can civil society organizations from the Western Balkans connect not only as a point of expertise, which I think is highly relevant and they have had an impact so far, but also with the EU citizens? What could civil society do to engage with European citizens, to have exchanges, to communicate on what this region is and what its value is? And I think the other component of it is perhaps to focus on bringing people closer together. So create forums in which these two counterparts, so civil society citizens from the European Union member states, civil society organizations from the European Union member states could come together. And these are the places where one can communicate not only the costs of enlargement, which have been discussed very broadly in the current discourse, but also the benefits, not only for the region and in the context of its growth, but also the benefits of enlarging to this region for the European Union and its citizens.
Thank you, Yelena. Helena, for your final reflection, yeah.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, you've asked at the beginning, are we going to be optimistic or pessimistic? And I think if everything stays exactly the same, I'm going to end on a very pessimistic note, because I honestly think that all the things that we've discussed so far, like the changes in which we talk about the EU enlargement, the extent to which the EU is engaged in trying to create this more positive imagery and positive campaign is also equally important. Like, I can blame, you know, I agree with Jelena. We can blame a lot of this on the press. When something bad happens in the Balkans, it ends all over the press in the EU. And when EU says something critical about the Balkans, it ends up in our local press, which I think then feeds into these kind of not necessarily hugely positive images we perhaps have, you know, of one another. And I think if we let it stay exactly as it is, and I think this also applies to the Kosovo-Serbia normalization talks, I'm not going to be very pessimistic that things are going to change for the better. But I am going to be optimistic in a sense that I think that, you know, it doesn't take too much to do certain things that would create immediate benefits. So what I'm going to end on is, like, to the extent to which your individual job or your individual position is related to the topics that we've been discussing today, and to the extent to which you can make some positive change in your role and in your environment, please do that. And I think if we all do that, inevitably we're going to see things change for the better. Thank you so much again for the invitation. I've really enjoyed being on this panel, and thank you to the panelists as well for their great comments.
Thank you, Helena. Now I'm going to close off. But we say in Kosovo that pessimists are experienced optimists. We're wrong so many
times. There's not much I need to add. I don't want to sour the mood even more, but I just would like to highlight more the responsibility that we have to kind of think about solutions and ways out more. So, but most importantly is to work on the values and on the social part of this, on society's part of it. But I would also think it's important to highlight the need for regional solidarity. I'm part of the Western Balkan Strategy Group of the Heinrich Böll Foundation, where we are experts from all over the region. And it makes a huge difference when we go as a region and speak in Brussels with one voice and support one another country. Like, you know, if we're from Kosovo, it doesn't mean that we don't need to talk in defense of North Macedonia and what is going with this dispute with Bulgaria, for example. I think we need to send more messages of support across the borders and not see all of these sort of only from individual country lenses. So yeah, I'll end with that. Thank you.
That's actually a perfect way of ending in a positive note of we need more regional
I found something. Okay.
Yeah, we need more regional solidarity, also would help on sustaining this Euro-Atlantic focus in our region. Now I want to invite you to help me appreciate the panel with a round of applause. And next, invite you to a lunch that will be served at the restaurant in the first floor right after the reception. And invite you to come back at 1:30, where we will have a fantastic panel moderated by my colleague Adelina on China and Russia. And we are very proud to have Victoria, who was former deputy minister in Ukraine government, join us for this discussion. And a very good panelists, including our China guy and China woman in the Balkans, Hannah and Stefan. So thank you.